I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me is Dr. Patrick Wyman. A couple of things to cover first. You may be able to tell that I'm sick. It came out of nowhere. I fell asleep last night with a fever. It broke in the middle of the night, so I'm feeling all right now, but the nose is an issue. So once again, we got that change of voice, and what an event to have it for, because we have some amazing fights to discuss today, as well as a great topic from one of our patrons at the end of the show. But I'm talking Tyron Woodley versus Stephen Thompson 2 to figure out who indeed is the better man after their draw at UFC 205. And then, of course, arguably the best lightweight matchup possible today in MMA, Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson. So, I'm sorry that I'll have to have the sick voice for that. Another thing is that, Pat, people loved that we got into a heated argument over a meaningless fight last week. So let me start things off by saying, screw you, you're a piece of shit, and everything you're about to say on today's episode is I already know it's going to be wrong, and I will dig in my heels.
Fuck you and your entire family. So let's get the ball rolling, huh? Let's start off strong.
Let's do it. Let's dive in. I have a feeling actually these are a lot of fighters we're going to agree on in a lot of ways. It's only after the fights that we seem to really disagree. Flukegate and now Middlegate from last week. But let's go ahead and dive in. Welterweight title fight: Tyron Woodley versus Stephen Thompson. Last time, I will remind people, since this is a rematch and a hotly anticipated one, last time I believe we both picked Stephen Thompson to beat Tyron Woodley. And it was a kind of fight in which Stephen Thompson won 3 rounds, but Tyron Woodley, being Tyron Woodley, also won the 2 rounds that he took much more clearly than Stephen Thompson was able to take, more or less more clearly than he was able to take the other 3, especially with that 4th round. So we have a really fascinating style matchup here, where obviously one guy throws more volume and relies on a wider array of tools. The other hits a lot harder and is arguably more surprising and dominant when he does connect. The other also has, this being Tyron Woodley, an uncanny ability to make high-volume fighters fall into his pace. I'm going to quickly bring up some statistics here. Let's see. I know this is great radio here. I've forgotten to get it up beforehand. But Tyron Woodley has a way of making fighters like Stephen Thompson throw less than they normally do. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to talk about. Let's see. Stephen Thompson threw against Rory McDonald, I think, 249 significant strikes and landed 110. And we all recall that was a pretty slow-paced fight. Not a lot.
Especially for the first 2-3 rounds, especially.
Yeah,
Thompson
definitely
only really picked it up in the 4th and the 5th round.
It was a low simmer for most of the bout. Against Tyron Woodley, I believe he threw only 141, so that is, he's down over 100, I think, from his fight with Rory McDonald, and landed only, he threw only 161, but landed only 43, compared to 110 in 2 fights, both of which seem slow-paced, but owing to Tyron Woodley's defense and his ability to use the threat of that power and speed to lull you in and slow you down, that it always makes it a different fight. When somebody who throws a lot of punches fights Tyron Woodley, the only guy who's been able to maintain that volume that I can think of is Rory McDonald.
Yeah, McDonald was literally the only one, and even he did not operate at quite the pace that he would normally prefer.
Especially in the first round. He had to warm it up quite a bit to get out of those. The most dangerous moments with a guy like Woodley, as Robbie Lawler discovered, is when he is most able to just shock you with his speed. Like, you literally are not used to how quickly he can move, and you will not see it coming.
Yeah, exactly. That's why athleticism can be adjusted to. If your opponent is a great athlete, if he's super fast, super strong, hits super hard, you can figure out how to work around that, because once you have the timing, you can do whatever, like it doesn't matter how fast somebody is. If you can see it coming, if you know the tells, then the raw speed becomes much less of an issue than it would be beforehand. Tyron Woodley's great genius, it seems to me, in his last few outings is figuring out how to stress or stretch, I guess, the surprising aspect of his power beyond the first round.
Uh-huh.
That to me seems to be the thing that he really figured out how to do against Thompson. And there were a couple of different things that he did to make this work. Like, it's possible to watch a Tyron Woodley fight and think, like, how are these guys not just blasting him over and over and over again when he backs up to the fence? How are they not just outworking him? What are they afraid of? What is the problem here? Why aren't they letting their shots go? But after about 2 or 3 times watching Woodley through, you start to realize how many little things he does that put his opponent off that game. That it's not just one thing. It's not just the speed. It's that he knows how to make you fear the speed. It's not just the power. He knows how to make you fear the power. It's that he knows exactly the right time to crack you with a counter to make you think twice about just filling the space up with volume. It's, well, maybe you're thinking about kicking. Well, normally that's not a thing that Woodley really bothers too much about, but this time he's going to catch the kick and take you down. Mm-hmm. He feints and fakes very actively. He's an active feinter, where most fighters would fill up that space with actual volume. With actual thrown strikes. Woodley fills it up with the threat of his strikes, which in some ways is actually more damaging, Like that it forces you to think harder and harder than just like, okay, I see this strike coming at my face.
Sure, yeah. The other thing is, and I think the main reason Woodley does that is because it requires pretty much no energy expenditure on his part to feint compared to letting go a full power shot. Because we can safely say of Tyron Woodley that when he throws, he pretty much throws everything with full power. And this is a very powerful man who has the ability to pour a lot of sudden energy into his strikes. So when he throws, it carries a lot. When he feints, he doesn't have to do that. He doesn't have to pour that energy in. But I do want to talk about all those points you raised are very salient, and I want to bring up one that's kind of connected to them. I want to talk about Woodley gassing because there are many mysterious things about Tyron Woodley, but to me, one of the most mysterious is that people are convinced that he has a habit of gassing out. And I don't understand this. I get pushback every time I bring it up. So I'm going to try and use some numbers. The best indicators I can think of for somebody exhausting themselves, especially when, like Woodley, they tend to spend most of their time in the UFC, at least, striking, is does their strike output fall from round 1 to round 3? And do they lose their power in the later rounds of the fight? And neither of those seems to be true with Tyron Woodley. I have a few numbers here for you. Woodley threw, let's see, against Jake Shields. Terrible fight, of course, but Woodley threw 27 strikes in the first round, 24 in the second, and 43 in the third. Against Rory McDonald, a fight that he lost, he went from 26 to 29 to 26, pretty even across the board, which does speak to some really nice control from Rory McDonald. Kelvin Gastelum, he threw 25, then 35, and then 44. Stephen Thompson, he went from 18 to 22 to 32 to 41 and finally 28, which suggests that the only reason he slowed down in the 5th round rather than building on that pace is that he basically used all that he had left trying to kill Stephen Thompson in the 4th.
Any fighter who did everything that Woodley did to finish in the 4th round of that fight would have been done.
Yes.
Like that was not a Tyron Woodley thing. That was anybody who throws a bajillion strikes trying to finish a hurt opponent is going to be gassed after that.
So Woodley is definitely cognizant of the fact. I'll just finish up my point real quick. Woodley's definitely cognizant of the fact that a fighter like him, who is heavily muscled and throws a lot of power and speed, is vulnerable to gassing. But the fact of the matter is, he doesn't gas because he's smart about the way he expends his energy. Yes, that means throwing a very low volume of strikes. He only throws about 5 significant strikes per minute, although he lands at a 50% clip or something like it. And Stephen Thompson throws twice as many strikes as that, almost, like 9 strikes per minute or something compared to Woodley's 5. But that adjustment is what makes it so that Woodley does not gas. It makes him so that, as he clearly showed against Stephen Thompson, he's still very dangerous in the championship rounds and the later rounds of a fight. And his volume, barring some huge attempt to finish, pretty much consistently goes up with each passing round.
This is the clearest example of a narrative that took hold early in his career, early in his UFC career. I think it was in that fight with Shields.
Yeah.
Where Joe Rogan went on and on and on and on and on about Woodley's frame and his musculature and how that meant that there was no way
against
that he could
Josh Koscheck as well.
Yeah, it was just constant, absolutely freaking constant. And, Woodley, for a variety of reasons, Woodley has spent most of his career in fights where Rogan has commentated.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he has mostly been a big card fighter. So we haven't had a lot of Brian Stan commentating on Tyron Woodley fights to give us a dose of something different, to give us a different kind of narrative. And Joe, I think we've talked about this before. I like Joe Rogan as a commentator.
Yeah.
My only critique of Joe Rogan is that because his prep, he doesn't really prep the way that other commentators do. He tends to rely on what he's seen from that fighter before and what he's said about that fighter before. His narratives of fighters from fight to fight tend to be very consistent. That was a narrative that he settled on with Woodley very early in Woodley's career, and he's just rolled it through every single fight.
It's like it's not even specific to Woodley. It's like a go-to narrative Joe has for every heavily muscled fighter, and it's typically like black dudes who look really good in their swimsuits. You know what I mean? You know the type of fighter. You know the code words explosive and athletic. Woodley totally fits the bill for the kind of fighter that Joe Rogan would say those words about. And so he says it. I think he maybe doesn't know that much about Tyron Woodley's game and the finer points of it. But to be fair to Joe, however, who again I do love as a commentator, like his ground knowledge, his enthusiasm is always welcome. But it is difficult, I think, to look at Tyron Woodley from any kind of technical or strategic perspective. You know, the kind of perspective you build studying lots and lots of other fighters. It can be difficult to look at Tyron Woodley and not see someone whose style is frustratingly limited. And it's only pretty recently, I think, for both you and myself, that we have started to appreciate that Tyron Woodley backing himself into the fence, Tyron Woodley throwing very little volume, those are not really, at least to Tyron Woodley, drawbacks. They are, in fact, adaptations to allow him to keep a style with which he is most dangerous.
Yeah, the closest analog for Woodley's game is Yoel Romero. They are the only guy, I think, who can and does fight in a way that is even close to similar to Woodley with anything like that level of effectiveness is Romero. I think that the two of them are the two best athletes in the UFC. I think they're the biggest, strongest, fastest, most explosive, most powerful. I think that they are head and shoulders above everybody else in that category in the entire UFC. And they're two guys who have figured out how to use their physical gifts in conjunction with a fairly specific set of skills in ways that maximize their talents while minimizing the problems that go along with that. Yoel Romero is another great example of the gassing narrative that you talked about, Connor, for exactly the same reasons. But if you look at Romero's career, Romero's volume doesn't really drop that much as the fight goes on. His finishes basically all come in the third round.
He and Woodley both, I mean, they both wear like a coat of sweat at the end of the fight, not to describe them like horses. They both perspire heavily and get real shiny by the third round. They both look a little more tired. Their mouths might open up. But as far as, everybody gets more tired by the third round of a fight. Nobody's going to have the same level of energy in the first round as doing the third. Not even Clay Guida is exactly the same as far as how he feels in the final round of a bout. But does it affect their fighting? And the answer seems to be no.
That's the real question. And that's the thing. I realized this years ago watching actually Justin Gaethje, because I was trying to figure this out. I'm like, he looks tired, but is it really affecting anything? Like, you can't, when you're trying to evaluate a fighter like that, you can't focus on, do they look tired? Everybody looks tired to a greater or lesser extent. All you can focus on is what they're doing.
Yeah.
And if they're still throwing strikes, if they're still shooting takedowns, if they're still landing with some pop, like if they're still effective, then are they really tired? I mean, or does it make enough of a difference for you to focus on that as a thing? Clint Hester was another fighter that always came to mind for this. Like, very much a journeyman, not a great fighter, but another really big muscular guy. And the commentators were always like, well, he looks gassed, he looks tired. But if you looked at what he was doing, he was still throwing, he was still landing with power into the second and the third round,
If I jump in the pool, I feel exhausted after like 8 laps, but I can swim a mile. I've done it many times, and I know every time I feel really tired very early into the mile, but the mile is still possible. You get used to being tired when you're in an athletic endeavor. Being tired is just, it almost becomes like a comfortable feeling where you're like, okay, I'm loose now. This is what I feel like when I fight. I have not seen any evidence to suggest that Tyron Woodley allows himself on a regular basis to gas to the point that he is actually hurting his ability to fight.
Yeah, that's the key distinction. So I suppose to bring it back to the matchup at hand here, does Stephen Thompson have the tools to force Tyron Woodley into the kind of fight that can tire him out? That's the more salient question, rather than is Tyron Woodley going to gas? In the first fight, what we saw was that Thompson did not have the tools to do that. Thompson was too tentative early on. He was too easily put off his high volume game. I talked to Thompson before that fight, had a really insightful, illuminating conversation with him. He's a smart dude. He understands his game really well. And the fact that he told me exactly how much he had practiced avoiding Woodley's right hand. He had a really powerful, really athletic guy throw lead rights at him over and over and over again so that he could practice his responses, practice his counters, get the timing, get the distance, get the speed, all of that. And he still got caught over and over and over again. So that tells you a lot, I think, about how good Woodley is. But also, I think that was kind of a psychological shock for Thompson, that he felt so prepared for it and still couldn't deal.
I imagine the same thing was true when he was taken down so quickly into the fight. That Stephen Thompson has his wrestling has become a very reliable part of his game. That he's stuffed takedowns from guys like Johnny Hendricks, among others. And Tyron Woodley managed to get him down instantly, which is not even a thing that Tyron Woodley typically does. But I have to wonder if Tyron Woodley just doesn't choose to take people down all that often. Because, of course, back in his Strikeforce days, he was the lay and pray master. That was what he was known for most, is holding people down and getting them down in order to keep them in that position. So is Tyron Woodley a better wrestler than he seemed in the UFC? A better takedown artist than he seemed? He's had success against Carlos Condit, and he had success against Stephen Thompson, although weirdly, after that early takedown, that was the last one I think that Tyron Woodley shot in the entire fight.
Yeah, let me look real quick here.
I'm pretty sure that was he hit one takedown, or he attempted one takedown and got one takedown,
and that was it. Yeah, I think he feinted a bunch more level changes, but that was it.
So that's the thing, is that there is something genuinely perplexing still about Tyron Woodley's style. I feel like I have a pretty good handle on it, or at least in a lot of the aspects that used to confound me. But there's still something about it. Tyron Woodley still does not throw a huge variety of strikes. And he does not always... I think maybe he's so concerned about marshaling his energy that he really holds back everything except the one weapon he's most comfortable with, which is his right hand. Because I imagine that Tyron Woodley throwing the same amount of volume would still be more effective if he just varied the type of power strikes he was throwing a little more. A little more takedowns, a little more kicks, some more left hooks, some more jabs. I know he can throw all those things very well. Technically, Tyron Woodley is a pretty damn good fighter, but he's almost entirely dependent on that right hand. Everything is kind of a throwaway to set up that right hand.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I think there are some benefits to knowing and understanding your game in the way that Woodley does, but there are also pretty obviously some limitations. I don't want it to sound like we're all over Woodley here. I think we also have a sense for what his weaknesses are, and that's that if an opponent can be well prepared for the right hand in the ways that Woodley sets it up, if an opponent can be prepared to accept the danger that goes along with pushing the pace against him, then he's a beatable fighter. Nobody is saying that Tyron Woodley is not beatable.
Yeah.
The question is whether an opponent is capable of doing those things without eating the fight-ending shot.
Yeah,
basically.
And to your point about Woodley knowing himself, you almost wonder if maybe he's kept himself from adapting in certain ways because he knows what works for him. And maybe so. I mean, has Tyron Woodley made any large adjustments to his fighting style or skill set ever? I mean, really, the only thing we could maybe call an adjustment, and I would be hesitant to do so, would be him getting comfortable enough to start striking with people. But that's not really adjustment. I think he talked to us when he came on the show and said that he basically just had to get confident enough that when he wasn't striking, wasn't throwing bombs, it was because he was a novice and just was scared. He said back in the day he was even scared of getting hit with a jab. He would flinch and freak out. So once he got confident enough, he's kind of been the same fighter. And we can't say that for Stephen Thompson. Stephen Thompson has made some very notable adjustments, particularly following that loss to Matt Brown, where, yes, he gained the confidence. Oddly, he seemed to gain his confidence after losing, maybe getting that loss out of the way, but also he drastically improved his wrestling and his scrambling. I think he improved his boxing ability and started to rely a little more on it, especially his defense. And we have seen Stephen Thompson blossom into that style. So if the question in this fight is who can adapt more readily from the last bout, I think it's probably Stephen Thompson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I just feel like, yeah, we know how analytical Thompson's approach is.
Yeah.
We know how he goes about adjusting. We know he's capable of doing that. He's a well-trained, smart fighter. Like I think there is a game plan out there that will allow Thompson to beat Woodley. But for me, the big question is how much danger does he put himself in against a super dynamic guy to make that happen? Like, I think that was the thing that you and I both underrated going into their first matchup. It seems to me was just how dynamic Woodley is.
Yeah.
And how small the opening is that he can exploit to put you in serious danger of losing the fight. Like that particular facet of the matchup hasn't changed.
Yeah,
I don't think, and that's why. So I'm picking Woodley. I think he'll land a fight-ending shot at some point. Thompson, like Woodley, is just so good at, in kind of weird ways, at exploiting some of the problems with Thompson's game. Like Thompson is very much a rhythm fighter, and Woodley is very hard to get a rhythm against. Thompson is kind of a slow starter. He mostly takes the first round off. Woodley is a very quick starter, really gets out of the gate fast. Thompson is hittable, especially on the counter, if you're willing to hang in and throw with him. Mm-hmm. And Woodley is a surprisingly sharp counterpuncher with really quick triggers. Like that, when you put all those things together, I see Thompson's path to victory. I just don't see how he does that without putting himself in a position where either he's going to get taken down and beaten up on multiple occasions, or he's going to eat those powerful right hands. Like that, Woodley, it only took Woodley one takedown to take Thompson's kicks away. And without his kicks, without his ability to set that ultra long range and then force you to cross it, if he's forced to work behind his jab, he is a above average but not especially threatening striker to me.
Sure.
So if Woodley can do that again, and I think he can, then that to me is the fight. That's the dynamic of the matchup. Before
we wrap up, I'm still kind of feeling Stephen Thompson. I'm going to proffer one adjustment that I think that he will probably make in this fight, and why I think that he can find the win. Because let's not forget, it is really hard to estimate how Tyron Woodley. It's a weird fight, right? Because it's the kind of fight where you can say of Stephen Thompson, he needs to fight a perfect fight to win. Like, he can't get caught. So on and so forth. But you also need to say Tyron Woodley needs to land a perfect strike to win. He needs to land that one big shot, because obviously Stephen Thompson's is tough enough to survive anything less, right? So you have both guys who have weird limitations to the way they can take each other on. And Tyron Woodley is certainly more comfortable with that style. And I think Stephen Thompson, not quite being able to kick as much, and also just not being great when he's pressuring. And Tyron Woodley, it instantly allows people to pressure him in almost every fight. He only pressures himself in very short bursts, usually after stinging somebody or when he really needs to get his back off the fence. But typically, Tyron Woodley, he backs up, he lets you corner him, he lets you close the distance a little too much, and then he surprises you with the right hand or takedown or whatever.
Yeah, that's actually something we didn't talk about at all, I don't think, in this episode. Is part of the reason Woodley was so successful is he just refused to play Thompson's game.
Right. And Thompson
completely refused to do it.
Yeah, he's obviously at his best when people are recklessly charging after him. In which case, like with Johnny Hendricks, he gets to look amazing. When he's pot-shotting you and angling and picking you off, he looks fantastic. He really is one of the best strikers in the UFC when he does that. But when he has to come forward, he was obviously a little frustrated against Tyron Woodley. And I think he's going to have no choice but to come forward again unless he literally both men just back up and stare across that 30-foot gulf at each other for 25 minutes, which won't happen. They'll be disqualified before that happens. So someone's going to come forward. It's probably going to be Stephen Thompson, because to win, Stephen Thompson needs volume. He's not going to put Tyron Woodley out with those single shots. He needs to rack up points. So I think one of the best ways he did that in the first fight, and I would say he's probably not going to fight his normal game because it's not the circumstances that allow him to do his normal thing. So he probably, again, won't throw as much volume as he has in past fights. He'll be a little more reluctant because he's going to be walking into Woodley's range. But one of the things he was most effective with in the first fight, especially in rounds 2 and 3, he was very effective when he got going, was in playing the role of the aggressive counterpuncher, which kind of allows Stephen Thompson to do what he's comfortable doing while still pressuring his opponent. Now, that means a slower-paced fight, because getting Tyron Woodley to lead is not as easy as it might seem. Getting him to put himself out there is not that easy. But Tyron Woodley throws himself out there when he puts himself out there. And Stephen Thompson is very capable of taking an angle and landing a right hand or snapping off a jab as Tyron Woodley comes forward. I think we're probably going to see a lot of that. If Stephen Thompson staying a little closer than his usual kicking range and being very patient and allowing Tyron Woodley to come off the fence before hitting him and not trying to charge in, because it's very clear that coming in after Tyron Woodley, it leaves him too open to counters. It makes it possible for Tyron to hurt him and to really surprise him by closing that gap. So I think we're going to see more of that. I do think Stephen Thompson, it's weird because this fight, there is really no argument over who won what rounds. You know what I mean? The rounds themselves were not close. When Tyron Woodley had a round, it was very clear. When Stephen Thompson had a round, it was less emphatic, but still pretty damn clear that it was a Stephen Thompson round. And so it's a matter of, will Tyron Woodley get those opportunities, or will Stephen Thompson rack up points while Woodley waits for those opportunities? And I think the latter is probably still the more likely outcome, especially saying that Stephen Thompson knows a little bit more what to expect this time around. So I'm going to go with Stephen Thompson by unanimous decision.
I'm really looking forward to it. That's a fantastic fight. I mean, we'll see how all of that sparring with Sage Northcutt has prepared Tyron Woodley for this. The best odd couple in MMA, if you're not following their exploits and misadventures, you should be. It's the greatest thing in the world. Woodley took Northcutt to see Birth of a Nation, and Sage emerged from that apparently woke about the horrors of slavery. The other day, Woodley, this was on one of the more recent episodes of Embedded, Woodley blew Northcutt's mind by showing him that you could put pepper on both sides of a chicken breast. I'm terrible at all things cooking related, and even I knew that you could put pepper on a chicken breast, man. Like, that is levels of caucasity that I don't know how you could possibly reach that.
You knew it was possible, at least. We were saying before the show, I imagine how much Sage Northcutt's worldview would be rocked if Tyron Woodley secretly put some sriracha on a sandwich or something. It would change his whole life.
Chipotle mayo?
Little Chipotle mayo.
See, that's the great paradox of Sage Northcutt. We all know that mayo is a white people thing, and Sage Northcutt is about as white as they come. But has Sage Northcutt, by virtue of his lifestyle, ever tasted mayonnaise?
No. Too rich.
Yeah, that's it, right? Is like there are a few things more quintessentially white person than mayonnaise. And while Sage Northcutt is the whitest person on the planet, still probably has never tasted mayonnaise. One of life's great paradoxes right there.
The only thing whiter than mayonnaise is a dry sandwich. Just turkey and cheese on whole wheat bread. That's a Sage Northcutt sandwich right there.
Wow. God, that is an excellent point, my friend. That is an excellent point.
It's a new level of whiteness. Where mayonnaise becomes...
That's Sage Northcutt, trailblazer, man.
Yeah,
trailblazer.
But who knows now that Tyron Woodley has gotten in his head and shown him the beauty of black pepper, that thing that only black people really eat in this country. There's so much for Sage to learn. So
I'm dying. I checked my Twitter. I tweeted this out with the caption, MMA's best odd couple. So You have to see this. Just the look on Northcutt's face is
it's my favorite thing now.
I mean, they're the best odd couple. Like the idea of a 35-year-old of a 35-year-old guy from Ferguson, Missouri, teaching the 20-year-old sheltered kid from the Houston suburbs about the joys of pepper and independent African American cinema is the greatest thing in the world.
Love it, man. Well, pray that Tyron Woodley gets to be champion, so we'll see more embeds and more documentaries involving him and Sage Northcutt.
This is what Fight Pass is for. Why do you have a Fight Pass platform if you don't give these guys a show?
Just give them a show. Just follow them around. Just have them go like dirt biking or whatever, like just watch them interact.
Yeah, I don't care anything. Like this is why you have an online platform with cheap content. Like this is shut it down, UFC.
Tyron's going to pay
us $1 million for this, and yeah,
put a camera on him. Have Tyron take Sage to like a soul food restaurant, and just watch. Make sure you have 3 cameras on Sage Northcutt's face when Tyron tells him they put paprika in the batter. It'll blow his goddamn mind. So.
That's going to be the meme-worthy reaction gif for the next 10 years.
Yes. What? Okay. All right. That's enough on that. We have another fantastic fight to discuss.
It's never enough on that.
That's true. But we have another fantastic fight to discuss in Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson. This is one of the hardest fights I've ever had to pick. So I'm going to secretly take 2 hours during this 30-second break to talk about it with myself. And when we come back, you will hear us getting into that. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back. Khabib Nurmagomedov, Tony Ferguson. Pat, I'm going to let you take this one away.
This is, I think, one of the 2 or 3 best fights that you could make in the entire UFC, not just in the lightweight division.
I agree.
It is, I think, the best fight you could make in the lightweight division as a matchup. I think it's the most compelling one at this particular moment because we don't know if Conor McGregor is ever actually going to defend his belt. But the winner of this fight will be a worthy champion, whether he ever fights McGregor or not. I mean, the two guys are 20-1 in their UFC careers. The only loss was when Ferguson broke his arm against Michael Johnson back in 2012. That was it. They have combined to win 20 fights.
It's insane.
And it tells you what this division is like, that neither man has gotten a title shot to this point. That's how good the lightweight division is. But it's just a ridiculously compelling matchup on every level. I mean, I think both are kind of new school fighters. They represent all of the stylistic trends of the last 5 or 6 years coming home to roost. The emphasis on volume and creativity, athleticism, a new round of stifling wrestle grapplers, the shift back in that direction away from like new generation of sprawl and brawl. Ferguson is a super creative grappler, like he funk rolls. It's all of these different stylistic trends embodied in these two fighters, meeting with high stakes on the line. I mean, I don't know what more you could ask for than that.
Yeah. It's amazing. It really is. Like it's a ridiculous fight. And this is why I've waffled so much on it. Because I think probably for a lot of people in the MMA community, it feels like you just have to pick Khabib because he hasn't lost yet. And because every time you think he's not going to just smash him with someone with his grappling, he does. So of the two, I think Khabib feels more like an inevitability, his style. But it's really tough because Tony Ferguson's insanely durable. He can take a hell of a beating. He's a very good scrambler on his back. He's also very difficult to pressure. And when he's not being pressured, when he has his range, or even when he is being pressured lightly, he's a very, very underrated boxer, especially when he's not fighting Lando Venata and doesn't seem to have completely overlooked his opponent. But against Rafael dos Anjos, I thought Tony Ferguson, over the course of that bout, just more and more with each round, took over the striking engagements between himself and a very good kickboxer in Rafael dos Anjos. So for me, I think the best way to jump into discussing this one is is to suggest, and I'm interested to hear what you think about this, is to suggest that I think the most important factor in this fight will be who gets to pressure, who gets to come forward and control the pace and the distance in this fight. Because if Nurmagomedov gets to come forward and pressure, something he likes to do, he will probably be able to get in on Ferguson's hips and do what he does best, putting him against the fence, get off some surprising strikes after the takedowns get going, yada, yada, yada. If Tony Ferguson is not pressured, or if he gets to pressure himself, he will probably, at least in the early rounds, light up Khabib Nurmagomedov a little bit on the feet.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because I think both of these guys are terrible matchups for the other in their secondary phases. So I think that it's hard to – I'm sorry?
No, right. That's exactly how I feel about it. Just agreeing.
Yeah, so like on the feet – Ferguson is the worst matchup in the division for the kind of game that Nurmagomedov likes to play because he throws such a high volume of strikes, because he's so long, because he uses it so well. He's so creative. There's nobody in the division. I don't think anybody, period, who is worse for Nurmagomedov than that. The combination of all those things. But conversely, there is nobody who is a worse wrestling and grappling matchup for Ferguson's style than Khabib, because Khabib, by the nature of his takedown game, does not leave his head in there. Yeah, so he's never going to give Ferguson the front headlock that he likes. Right?
We've talked about that before, but can you explain briefly the Nurmagomedov takedown style?
Oh, okay. Well, so let me start with Ferguson's counter wrestling style real quick. Ferguson's counter wrestling style is all based on open space. That he has one of two approaches. Either he sprawls and grabs a front headlock, or he likes to funk roll through your takedown. So a funk roll is a style of wrestling that involves not meeting your opponent's momentum with momentum, but rolling with your opponent's momentum. So Ben Askren is the master of this kind of funk roll wrestling style.
Wrestling Aikido.
I'm sorry?
Wrestling Aikido.
Yeah, and Aljamain Sterling is another guy who likes funk. Ferguson is not an especially active wrestler in the UFC, but he has really focused hard on this kind of one aspect of funk in his style. But so in open space, it's all about rolling through the shots or grabbing the front headlock, snapping down and grabbing the front headlock when his opponent shoots on him. Nurmagomedov keeps his head up higher with his takedowns. The way that he enters does not leave a lot of room for grabbing the head. He rarely hits like a head outside double. Yeah. For the most part, he's got his head right in your chest or right in your solar plexus, usually up a little higher, or he's hitting his takedowns from the clinch. So there are very few opportunities in there for you to grab a front headlock. The nature of his shot game does not leave a whole lot of opportunities for funk rolling, even when he's not up against the cage, which he usually is. So if Khabib gets his hands on Ferguson, as good a defensive wrestler as Ferguson is, Nurmagomedov just does not do a lot of the things that Ferguson normally capitalizes on to generate his submission and ground offense. Yeah,
absolutely. And here's the thing is I've noticed both guys against Rafael dos Anjos. I think both guys fighting Rafael dos Anjos was a good marker of how effective they were at pressuring and enforcing their game on an opponent. Because dos Anjos, I think, is very clearly a guy who really needs to pressure to do well. And both guys managed to pressure him. So it shows that both of them, I think, can make that game work against somebody else who is also determined to play the same game they want, with obviously some variation there. But one thing I noticed about Tony Ferguson a lot in the Dos Anjos fight is that he was almost never backed into the fence, which was really striking to me. That Dos Anjos is a guy who is always backing people into the fence, always making them fear him to the point that they back straight up and they corner themselves. And Tony Ferguson was almost never backed into the fence, and when he was, he never stood there and waited for Rafael dos Anjos. So does that bode well for Khabib Nurmagomedov or poorly? Because if he were to take Ferguson down against the fence, he might be able to smash him if he's playing a guard game, but it might also allow Ferguson to stand up using the fence to get back to his feet. And if he can't get him against the fence, can Khabib get him down in open space? And if so, how does that change the kind of bottom game Ferguson will play against him? Do you think Khabib will be more effective getting takedowns against the fence or more effective getting takedowns in open space? Because judging by that RDA fight, I don't think Ferguson's going to be taken down as often cornered, because I don't think Khabib is going to be more effective enough with his striking to get him there.
So that's the real crux of this fight. And you're right about that Dos Anjos fight for Ferguson. To me, that reinforced this idea that Ferguson, like, while he prefers to pressure and swarm, is way more of a jack of all trades than we've given him credit for. Like, and it made me realize too, and I think I had known this before, but it reinforced it to me, that all of the wild shit that Ferguson does is just built on this really strong core of fundamental boxing. Like, he is a really, really, really good and diverse boxer. He's got a great jab, puts together great combinations, has a great rhythm, great sense of flow. And the kicks, the elbows, the knees, the spinning shit, that's all great. And it's part of what makes him such a dangerous fighter. But at the end of the day, his bread and butter is boxing. He knows his bread and butter is boxing. And when threatened, that's what he goes to.
Yeah, there are times when I think Tony Ferguson is too reliant on the fact that he has amazing stamina and that he can take a huge shot. I mean, we've seen that. The Edson Barboza fight. Who knows how that would have gone for him, you know, because he lost the first round of that bout, I think. And who knows how it would have gone if he hadn't upkicked Edson and gotten that choke. But there's also maybe something to be said for the fact that Tony Ferguson bases how crazy he's going to be on who he's fighting. And that given someone like Edson Barboza, who has been vulnerable to pressure and doesn't have the greatest chin, or given someone like Lando Venata, who's probably not going to be able to outlast him or keep up because he's on short notice, doesn't it make sense to kind of just go crazy and throw everything you have in the bag at them and pressure them? It's at least rational, even if it's not the safest way to approach a fight. And so I'm not sure he'll do any of that against Khabib either.
Yeah, no, that's the real question here, right? Like, I think that there is no question in my mind that if one of these guys has to go to their B game, Ferguson is going to be the one who's more effective sticking and moving and kind of playing boxer puncher than Khabib would in that same role. Yeah. I think Khabib has to pressure. I think he has to get Ferguson to the fence. To answer your earlier question, I think that a great deal of what Khabib does, practically all of what Khabib does, is predicated on having the fence, at least against elite opposition. Now, it's not quite as straightforward as he has to slowly and methodically back you up. He's happy to kind of let you chase him. You overextend, he cuts a really tight angle, spins you around, and suddenly you're against the fence when you were the one pressuring. Like, he did that a lot to Dos Anjos. Yeah. You know, Dos Anjos would pressure, chase him, get him back, and then all of a sudden, Dos Anjos throws one wild strike, Khabib slips, pivots, and all of a sudden we're wrestling against the fence. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's quite as straightforward as, you know, Khabib has to chase him. I think I can easily see scenarios in which Ferguson lands a good shot or two, like feels the aggression coming on, chases Khabib, and then all of a sudden ends up in kind of a grinding clinch wrestling battle.
Sure. So who do you like in the fight? I think it's harder to pick, honestly, than Woodley Thompson. And I say that knowing that both of us have already picked opposing fighters in that matchup. Because even if you can't, from my perspective anyway, I just can't settle on one guy. There's so many ways that both men, and I know too that even if part of me thinks that Nurmagomedov is, I think, probably worse in Ferguson's best area than Ferguson is in his. Maybe not in this specific matchup, but Nurmagomedov is more vulnerable, I think, on the feet than most fighters in the top 10 of the lightweight division. I don't think I respect what he does with his striking, and I don't think he's nearly as bad as some people say, but he's also not Tony Ferguson. You know, he's not on Tony Ferguson's level as far as the variety of techniques he can throw, his reach, his accuracy, none of that.
Ferguson would still be a top 5 fighter in this division, even if he couldn't do all of the great stuff that he does with his counter wrestling and his submission game. Just on pure striking, he would still be a top 5 fighter. Absolutely. And that would not be the case for Khabib. His striking works because his grappling. So even though I think that has been the case in a lot of Khabib's fights, and there's this weird feeling that you can't say that Khabib won't get his game going until you see it happen. Because
even the people who have made some headway have not been able to stop it. The most successful guy who in the UFC has been Gleison Tibau, and he lost that fight. All he did was defend the takedowns. He couldn't get his game going because he spent so much time defending the takedowns. If you want to,
and frankly, and in raw terms, Gleison Tibau is a much sounder defensive wrestler than Tony Ferguson is.
Right, yeah. So if you want to beat Khabib Nurmagomedov, you have to get after him. And if you get after him, he'll probably hit takedowns. But,
yeah, that's kind of the paradox here, right? Is how disciplined can Ferguson be with this approach?
Yeah.
Like, how can he stick Khabib on the end of his strikes over and over and over again, avoid sitting down on a combination to kind of exchange with him? Because we know Khabib will exchange with him.
Yeah.
Like, he will absolutely do that. So the question is, I just have such a hard time seeing Ferguson playing a super disciplined game for the entirety of the fight.
Oh yeah.
Like that's not a knock on Ferguson at all. I think it's just at kind of a basic level, the wild man is always going to be in there. And I think if he gets wild at all, then he's going to put himself in the kinds of positions where Khabib can take him down. And Ferguson's willingness to play on the ground, his willingness to scramble and roll and try all sorts of shit, like that is, you just cannot engage with Nurmagomedov in that way. Like I for the most part, we're all about on this show engaging with your opponent in their area of strength just to show them you can't be messed with, like that you can't be rolled through there. I think Khabib is the one exception to that if you play with him at all, he's so far ahead of everybody that you're gonna lose the round. The second that you consent to engage him at all in the areas where he's best, you have lost. It's
the only guy I can think of who's had that same feeling about him. There's two other guys, I guess. Cain Velasquez, and he was fighting heavyweights, not lightweights, and GSP. The only guys I can think of who basically, no matter who you were, you didn't have a chance if they got their hands on you and started to work their grappling game. And it's another thing. It's just a whole nother level of ability that Khabib has. But here's the thing: Tony Ferguson is extremely tough. He's as tough as Michael Johnson, right? If not tougher. He took all, Michael Johnson.
I think way tougher, I would say.
Sure, but he took all those shots. He could probably take all the shots that Michael Johnson took from Khabib Nurmagomedov and more, which means that the fight's not over for him when he gets taken down. He's also, I think, more mentally durable. So he's not going to fold and let his game, he's not going to abandon what he's good at just because Khabib one time managed to get a takedown off of it. So he's not going to lose heart the way RDA and Michael Johnson did after the first takedown, which is frequently what happens for Khabib. And if that's not the case, then Tony Ferguson also has unbelievable stamina. And we've said this in the past, but I have a feeling that because of how high energy his style is, and judging by his body language in later rounds, Khabib Nurmagomedov he's not always fresh, but he's usually less tired than his opponent is because his opponent has to work so hard to stop him. But if his opponent works hard and stops him a few times and is still not as tired as him, and Khabib is the more tired guy, does it start to become a downward slope for him in the later rounds of the fight? Because I have wondered if Tony Ferguson's stamina was very good, but the pace he kept against Rafael dos Anjos in Mexico City was insane.
I have never seen anything like that.
It was Yair Rodriguez against Alex Caceres, and even Yair had to get a second wind in that fight. Tony Ferguson, it is insane how fresh he kept himself through 25 minutes of grueling fighting. And to his credit, Rafael dos Anjos was very fresh too, but that only made it more impressive that Tony Ferguson kept him behind throughout basically all of the last 4 rounds with only a few hiccups. So
it's unbelievable.
Can Khabib compete with that kind of conditioning?
That's the real question. I don't think we know how Khabib's style will play over 5 rounds because Khabib is kind of a weird mixture of attributes, right? Like he's a grinder, but he's a super explosive one.
Yes.
I don't think we have truly realized or appreciated what a great athlete Khabib is, because there are other guys who have a lot of the same skill sets that he does. Like Islam Makhachev has essentially the same skill sets that Khabib does. There's very little difference in terms of what they're trying to do in the cage. But Khabib is a way better fighter than Islam Makhachev will ever be, because he's so much faster and so much more explosive, and he's so quick when he gets in on you. Like Rafael dos Anjos is a really good athlete. and Khabib was easily the faster fighter in that matchup.
Yeah.
Michael Johnson is one of the 3 or 4 best athletes in that division, and Khabib was clearly the faster fighter in that matchup. Like, maybe not faster hands, but quicker feet. And when Khabib exploded, he was on Johnson, Like, that to me says a very great deal. Ferguson is also a great athlete, but I don't think Ferguson has fought anybody as fast as Khabib. And maybe, sure. I guess, Edson Barboza?
Well, there you go. But obviously a very different skill set.
Well, different kind of speed, Like, it's hard. Khabib has crazy straight line speed in the way like an NFL running back does,
Yeah.
Like when he decides he's going to explode, all of a sudden he's on you before you think he's there. It's like closing speed.
Yeah, and he does a good job of hiding those takedown entries with his punches as well. So there's two things preventing you from seeing what's actually about to happen to you.
Yeah, it makes him seem even faster than he already is. Like he's already super fast, and by the time he has done such a good job of distracting you from the entry that by the time he's on you, he's really there. He's on your hips, or he's got his underhook or whatever he's going for. So I'm picking Khabib in kind of a back and forth, like a 48-47 decision. I see Ferguson's path to victory. I would not at all be surprised if he won. But, you mentioned this at the beginning, and as ridiculous as this is, Khabib is still undefeated, and there's a reason he's undefeated. Yeah. And, like, until we see him lose, it's really hard for me to pick how he's going to. Like, I think we see the outlines of it. Ferguson sticks him at range over and over, works him with volume, tires him out, drags him into the later rounds, and submits him or finishes him with strikes in the 4th or the 5th. Like, that seems like the path to victory.
And survives, really survives, is tough and durable and well-conditioned enough to survive the inevitable takedowns, because I do think, to a certain extent, they are inevitable when you're fighting Nurmagomedov.
There's just no way around them. So that's my read on this fight. I'm picking Khabib. Obviously, there are a ton of caveats. I think it's totally insane that Khabib is like a 2-1 favorite right now. I think that's just nuts. Absolutely crazy.
Yeah. Man, I think the weird thing is both of these guys are typically in such one-sided fights. You know what I mean? Like, both of them are. That's why it's so hard to pick, I think, because Tony Ferguson, when he gets an edge, really tends to pull away, even if he has difficulty early on. When he gets an edge, he pulls away spectacularly. And likewise for Khabib. And so I could easily see this being a clash that becomes a one-sided fight, except that both guys have the tools to make sure that they can get themselves back into it at any time. I guess I'm going to take Khabib. It's really tough, though, man. Like, I don't have any confidence in it at all. I'm making a pick because people expect me to make a pick. But in reality, I'm just excited to watch this fight.
So let me ask. Let's turn this on its head a little bit. Would you be surprised if either guy blew out the other? If they just showed up and in the first round, Khabib ragdolled Ferguson to the mat, beat the crap out of him from the top, and got a stoppage? Or alternatively, Ferguson just buzzes Khabib over and over again with shots and finishes him inside 3 minutes? Would either of those outcomes really surprise you?
No, nor would it surprise me that they have a back and forth fight early and that down the stretch one of them completely takes over. Because I know both of them can do that. That if once Khabib gets his takedowns going, maybe it just doesn't matter how your confidence is, you just keep getting taken down once he gets you down once. Or maybe Khabib starts to tire because Ferguson survives the early takedowns, and then Ferguson, being fresher and having the reach advantage, starts to just pick him apart with violence in the later rounds. I think
none of those outcomes are surprising at all. There's such a wide range of potential things that could happen here that are within the realm of possibility.
Yeah. That's why it's so hard to pick, because maybe it's just a back and forth fight the whole time with both guys just constantly countering each other and trading rounds. Or having rounds in which there is no clear winner and we have a contentious decision. I mean, there are so many ways this fight could go. That's why I've had so much difficulty picking it. And I really thought until I said Khabib that I was going to pick Tony Ferguson. Like, I just don't know, man. I'm just looking forward to watching it. It's going to be... It's MMA, combat sports is all about having questions answered. And this is a fight where many, many questions will be answered, in the way that the ending conflict of a movie answers all the questions you wanted to be answered, all the things the plot set up, and it all comes to a resolution. That's how this fight feels to me. It's the climax of a very interesting film called The Lightweight Division.
Yeah, they were scheduled to fight for the first time all the way back in December of 2015.
Thank God
so
they didn't.
This has been a long time coming.
Thank God they didn't fight then, by the way. I'm much happier that this fight is happening now because I did not like the way Khabib looked against Daryl Horcher. I don't want to see Khabib off of a long layoff fighting Tony Ferguson.
Yeah, that would have been nuts. But now it's here. Very stoked for this. I'm going to be there live in person in the crowd. I don't have to work the event. This is going to be fantastic. I'm very excited.
Happy for you, man. Happy for all of us. It's going to be a great one. Let's take one more break. When we come back, we have a question from one of our patrons. We're going to be discussing clinching, both in boxing and in MMA, and kind of get into the history of clinch fighting and how it works for different combat sports.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
And welcome back to Heavy Hands. As promised, we have a topic suggestion from one of our beloved patrons. If you too would like a topic answered or discussed in depth on the show, you can go ahead and check us out on Patreon. $20 a month gets you a topic, basically a whole segment of your choice. $5 gets you a short question answered on the show. This week's topic comes to us from Mark Guagenti, and Mark says, clinching in hypothetical boxer versus MMA fighter in a boxing rule set. That's what he wants us to talk about. Obviously, he says there are key differences in equipment, time, and strikes that make it fundamentally different between MMA clinch and boxing clinch. But are there truly best clinch practices prevalent in high-level boxing? What level of drilling and sparring in the clinch is practiced? From what I have seen in high-level boxing, it seems that boxers have well-practiced maneuvers, but I would not call it a systematic or deep well of techniques as in MMA. Am I wrong? Of course, getting to the good part, does a scenario exist where Floyd's clinch game is not deep enough to deal with Conor McGregor's? The question we all want answered. Is it possible with a size and strength advantage and a technique advantage, Conor McGregor could win the battle inside? So let's get to that at the end. And let's go ahead and talk about the prevalence of clinching in boxing. Obviously, it's more prevalent in MMA, but how do they differ? And are there techniques that each could learn from the other to help in their respective sports?
Those are a lot of good questions here. I think it's interesting to me that he's hit on that the boxing clinch is a real thing. Like there are a lot of boxers who do very good work there. I think the clinch is not as big a part of modern boxing as it was definitely 50 years ago, and certainly not 100 years ago. Yeah. What's really striking is this has always been interesting to me is this video of gentleman Jim Corbett in the 1920s when he must have been 60 years old, in his 50s or 60s,
with Gene Tunney.
Yeah, exactly. Teaching clinching techniques that involve like physically grabbing a wrist, establishing wrist control, and then using your free hand to throw body head combinations. So the modern boxing clinch, not nearly as developed. That doesn't mean there aren't still good clinchers in boxing these days, though, right, Connor?
Yeah, of course. And there probably would be a lot more of that still in boxing if the gloves still had an articulated thumb. Because the difference for Corbett is that his gloves, they called them mufflers back then, you could open your whole hand. You could move your thumb around. And nowadays the thumb on boxing gloves is fixed in position. It's sewed to the side of the fist, which is not because it's actually a better position for safe punching. It actually makes the hand slightly more vulnerable to breaking because, as we all know, if you want a tight fist, you wrap your thumb over the front of your knuckles to sort of trap them against your palm. But it does prevent you from using your thumb to gouge people's eyes, which is the best implement with which to do that in boxing when the rest of your fingers are all mittened together inside the glove. So with the thumb fixed, you cannot manipulate limbs, hold wrists, and stuff like that as well as you once could. But clinching is still a big part of boxing. I would make a comparison between the boxing clinch and the MMA clinch, that the boxing clinch, let's put them both in MMA terms, the boxing clinch is more like the ground and pound of Cain Velasquez, where it's less about strictly controlling you and more about sort of controlling you for an instant at a time and allowing you to move into positions in which you are vulnerable. And the MMA clinch is typically more like the Jake Shields style of ground game, where control and locking down positions is a lot easier and a lot more useful to an MMA fighter because he has different options in the clinch. Boxers, there's not really a ton of purpose other than just saving yourself why when you step into the clinch you would wrap somebody up and try to hold them tight. And so the best clinchers in boxing don't tend to do that a lot. We call that punch and clutch. That's holding, not necessarily clinching. The clinch does not necessitate getting a grip of someone and not letting them move. It's all about getting avenues to striking. And if you want to look at some people who do this well, we'll talk about them a little more over the course of this segment. But Roberto Duran, phenomenal clinch fighter, did very little holding throughout his career. Andre Ward doesn't do nearly as much holding as people say he does. Very good clinch fighter. Floyd Mayweather does do quite a bit of holding, still very good on the inside when he wants to let his hands go. And so there is variety in what you want to do inside, but there are still people in boxing who know how to use the clinch as an offensive range.
Yeah, exactly. It's a rare skill, but it's one that does still exist in boxing at a high level. And I mean, who would you point to as the best practitioners of that in boxing today, Connor?
I mean, Andre Ward's up there. Gennady Golovkin does it quite well. Roman Gonzalez, very good and tight. Let me think. I would say Errol Spence, very good up and comer in the inside. And Spence is a great guy to study if you want to see that sort of essential difference between how you approach a boxing clinch versus an MMA clinch, because he does a lot of the things that suit boxing when they wouldn't necessarily suit pure wrestling. His main focus seems to be on keeping his hands inside those of his opponents. That's the big thing. He wants a line of attack, and Roberto Duran did that as well. You'll see very little, overhooking or underhooking. He does not want his hands to stray outside the line of his opponent's torso. He wants to keep him close to his body and close to the center line of his opponent. And so he's constantly almost allowing his opponent to parry his hands, keeping them inside the palms of the other guy so he can drive in short punches. And then he augments that with head pressure, which is something that is very important both in MMA, the MMA clinch and in the boxing clinch, is knowing how to pressure, I guess, is more important in MMA when you have the fence especially, but knowing how to position your head on the inside. I was once told in the clinch that the best rule inside in boxing is to always try to look at the other guy's ear. Is to try to get or if you're not looking at it, get your forehead against his temple or his ear. If you're constantly trying that, then you are creating angles, and you can drive in and off-balance the other guy while you maintain a stable position. If you do that while keeping your hands inside as often as possible, you're going to have a lot of obvious opportunities to score punches and push the other guy around the ring. Henry Armstrong, by the way, an amazing fighter to watch if you want to see good head position in boxing. But how about MMA? What do you think are the most important things in the MMA clinch?
Well, so I think it depends on where you are, right? I think that there are fairly substantial differences in the MMA clinch depending on whether you're clinching against the fence or clinching in open space. And that, to me, I think the open space clinch is something that we're starting to see a little bit more of in MMA than we used to. Like, it used to be that the clinch was almost exclusively a thing that happened against the fence. For reasons that are better and worse, I think ranges tend to be longer in MMA, so there are fewer transitions in and out of the space where you can both grab onto each other. That mostly happens where there's simply no more space to do that. But now I think we're seeing a little more as we're seeing more fighters who are willing to fight in the pocket, which is a development that's happened more and more over the last few years. I think we're seeing more and more of that. In open space, I think the MMA clinch has things to learn from boxing, especially keeping your hands inside, the uppercuts. You see that, I think we saw that with Derek Brunson against Anderson Silva a lot.
Yeah,
right?
John Jones also does it very well. I actually think I drew this, and Cormier has some good tricks too. I think I actually drew a direct comparison between a move that Cormier did to tie up John Jones's wrist and the move that Jim Corbett was teaching Gene Tunney.
You did exactly so.
Yeah,
I remember that very.
So there's definitely a crossover where those boxing techniques can be more utilized better in MMA.
Yeah, precisely, and for a variety of good reasons. So I think in the clinch with your back to the fence, head pressure is everything.
Yeah.
I think way more so than it is in boxing. Head pressure is absolutely everything. If you're the one who's controlling with head pressure, then you're the one who's winning those exchanges. I think we saw that a lot in the Germaine de Randamie versus Holly Holm fight. Like, even though de Randamie had her back to the fence for large sections of those exchanges, she was the one who, by and large, was controlling head position.
Yeah. So that's absolutely essential. But the big thing in MMA, as opposed to boxing, is where your hips are, because you can throw knees because of takedowns. Like, where your hips are relative to your opponents is way more important in MMA than it is in boxing. Sure.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But there's obviously the MMA clinch is a more diverse clinch. There's more that you can do there simply because the rules allow for it. I think that doesn't mean that there aren't things that MMA can't learn from boxing. I think punch and clutch is something that more MMA fighters should work on, simply because there are fewer restrictions on how you can do that in MMA.
What do you do with your clutch? I mean, Demetrius Johnson uses it to hit beautiful takedowns. Mm-hmm. It totally works for MMA. And
it works even better in MMA.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it does. Because you're not just saving yourself after hitting somebody. You're not just protecting yourself. You're advancing your position. There are ways that you can use it to gain even further advantage. So yeah, there are. I think it may be. We may still be at the point where boxing is still like the least respected part of the MMA oeuvre. You know what I mean? Where nobody really talks about, at least in like mainstream fight commentary, nobody seems to talk about boxing fundamentals or how prevalent they are or are not in any given fighter. Whereas we definitely hear a lot more about the wrestling and jiu-jitsu aspects from a more technical perspective. And fighters focus more, I think, on the specifics of those. And this is just sort of maybe the nature of striking. Intangibles matter more. Like just hitting hard or taking a shot. Those things have a much bigger influence. It's less about like let's match skill against skill and who's going to get to hold a position for 5 minutes. There's no 5 minutes in one position in a striking game. Things happen very quickly, and I think athleticism maybe matters a lot when you have space that you can quickly cover and when one perfect shot changes things for good. But there are definitely things that a lot of things from the boxing realm that MMA fighters could be bringing into their games that we're not yet seeing, even as we sort of reach a striking renaissance in the sport. So let's talk, before we wrap it up, about the MMA clinch in the boxing skill set. Mark asked about Conor McGregor versus Floyd Mayweather, which I know we're both very excited about. How does that matchup, do you think, look? Even if we're not saying specifically about those two guys, although we will bring them into it, how does the MMA clinch look against the boxing clinch in the boxing rules? Well,
so I pointed to this. I did an interview on CNN International a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about McGregor Mayweather, and the host asked me how I thought that fight would go down, or whether, basically McGregor would have a chance. And I think that the clinch is exactly where he would have a chance against Floyd Mayweather, simply because in MMA you are used to roughhousing in the clinch in a way that you are probably not really in boxing, especially Floyd, who has so carefully picked his officials over the years, who is really aware of what the rule set is, how to bend them and how to use them to his advantage in the clinch as much as anything. I don't think, like, Floyd to me has always struggled when guys were willing to just get rough with him.
Yeah.
Like, I think that has always kind of been a problem for him. And if McGregor is a smart fighter in this very, very hypothetical matchup still, I think that's how he would win that fight, is by getting inside, making it dirty, driving his head into Floyd's chin, and creating opportunities and places to land his left hand. I think that would be his best and really only path to victory from my perspective.
How the rules are enforced matters a lot, though. I'm always in support of boxing refs letting clinches go on, but they almost never do. There are very few guys out there who will just let fighters work in the clinch. I was really pleased, for example, with how much clinching we get to see in Ward Kovalev. I thought it was a very compelling aspect of that matchup where both guys got a lot of good work done. So I thought that was really interesting, and I was glad we got to see it. But then, for example, Maidana versus Mayweather 2, how many times were clinches broken up when both guys had an arm free? You know, or when maybe just one guy sort of put his hands out to show that he wasn't holding, and that causes the clinch to get broken. That happens a lot in boxing. And so how much time does Conor McGregor have to ply what may be a roughhousing advantage in the clinch? Or does it just require Floyd to wrap both hands around his waist and a break is caused?
Yeah, that's the really compelling thing, is we won't know until that fight goes down. Precisely how that would go. But to me, that seems like that's where McGregor could actually make hay against somebody who is by every measure a better technical fighter. Yeah. Like, just make it rough and dirty and make it as little like a boxing match as humanly possible.
Spinning back fists. Throw nothing but spinning back fists.
Yeah. I mean,
they used to have those in boxing too, by the way. They used to have spinning back fists.
Maybe toss out a little low kick every now and again. I don't know. Throw some elbows.
Hey,
do what you got to do.
Maidana hit a good double leg. It's not like you can't get one or two of them off. You got a chance. We all know, the Diaz brothers taught us well how Floyd feels about the double leg.
Yeah,
he can't fucking stop it.
Floyd can't fucking stop a double leg, man. Oh God, I sincerely hope this fight happens. I realize that especially maybe among the hardcore fan set in MMA, there isn't a whole lot of desire to see this fight.
Yeah,
I would really like to see it. I mean, just because it would be crazy. The whole thing would be ridiculous. And
it already is ridiculous.
Well, yeah, but like combat sports are supposed to be fun, and you know what's fun? Crazy shit.
Yeah,
like. It would be totally crazy. Like a 40-year-old Floyd Mayweather talking shit to Conor McGregor and Conor McGregor talking shit back to him. Imagine the press conference. The press conference alone would make this whole crazy thing worth it. Who cares about the fight? Like, God, I mean, maybe something wild happens. Maybe McGregor lands a left hand and puts out like the greatest boxer of this generation. How awesome would that be?
Man,
let's have a little chaos in our lives, man.
McGregor is not afraid to get personal. He would have a lot of material to work with on Floyd as far as trash talk is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
We would hear a lot of stuff about illiteracy and domestic violence and all kinds of shit. It would get ugly.
Yeah.
And I would watch it.
Let's have some ugliness, man. This is Trump's America. Let's get ugly.
Yes, God damn it, because we can. Okay, so that does it. Thanks.
The boundaries have changed, bro.
Absolutely, yeah. Don't put up a wall between boxing and MMA. That's what I'm saying. Don't build that wall. Thank you, Mark, for your question, or your topic suggestion, rather. We will be getting to more topic suggestions and questions. If you have not, if you are already a patron, you haven't sent them to us in the past 2 or 3 months, then go ahead and send us your second batch. We've already got quite a few people who responded, so that's great. We look forward to getting to those on future episodes, and we hope that you are as compelled by UFC 209 as we are. It's a shame. It truly is a shame that no Diaz brother is competing on this card, because it absolutely, hopefully we'll get a Diaz brother, a 50-year-old Diaz brother on UFC 420 whenever that happens. But 209 really was the best opportunity to get one of them in there. Even so, Tyron Woodley and Stephen Thompson, Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson, those two fights alone make this a spectacular card, and there are so many other good matchups on here. On this week's bonus episode, by the way, we're going to be talking about some of our other favorite fights from this card, because it does have a lot of interesting talent speckled all throughout the lineup. Otherwise, that's it for today's episode. Thank you all for tuning in and joining us. If you came here today for the finer points... Oh, wait. Do we want to plug some shit first?
Yeah, let's plug.
Okay.
Let's do some plugs.
Boy, once I start that outro, I can't stop. So we're very lucky that I remembered.
What are you doing this week, Connor? What do you got going out?
I'm working on a 2-part thing on Tyron Woodley. I want to get into somewhat of his background and everything. I was hoping to get an interview with him, although I'm not sure he'll have time. So I may be doing a second piece in which I talk to him after the fight, because I'm always interested to learn and try to understand that guy. But I want to talk about sort of I'll be doing a very in-depth piece looking at his personality, his background, and how that reflects itself in both how he carries himself in the cage and outside of it. I'm going to do a video that goes along with that, sort of a summarized version of the article in video form. And I think we will have a League of Extraordinary Journeymen coming out this week as well to recap the crazy middleweight action that occurred at last week's card. I say crazy, the middleweight action that occurred at last week's card. So Phil McKenzie and I will be working on that. and a full Sherdog preview of UFC 209 on Sherdog.com. That should be coming out midweek. How about you, Pat?
I got a bunch of stuff.
Of course.
I will have a complete guide to an in-depth preview of every fight on UFC 209 that will be coming out on Wednesday on Bleacher Report. On Tuesday, the day before this episode comes out, I will have a complete breakdown of Nurmagomedov Ferguson, also on Bleacher Report. I will have a more narrative look at the adjustments that each fighter can make in Woodley Thompson 2 coming out on Thursday on Bleacher Report. Then I will have a GIF-heavy piece on the Washington Post looking at Woodley or looking at Nurmagomedov Ferguson for the Washington Post. That should be on Thursday also. I will also be doing a new episode of Fall of Rome this week, looking at communications networks and mobility. Basically, I'm going to try to break down my dissertation for a popular audience. So I'll tell you all about the thousands and thousands of letters that I read in communications networks and roads and ports and infrastructure and all that good stuff.
Well, there you have it. Dr. Patrick Wyman at it again. Get at us on social media if you need to ask us any questions or whatever, at Patrick_Wyman, at Boxing Bush, that's BUSCH. Both of those are, of course, for Twitter. And look forward to our work this week as much as we are. Pat has all kinds of interesting shit coming out. And I also have some articles that I am writing. So that's how it usually goes. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. If you came here for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.